In July of 1848, a resounding gunshot echoed through the bustling village of Thornhill. Squire Benjamin Thorne, the founder of the village and its most prosperous and prominent citizen, walked miserably into the woods behind his house and killed himself. This marked the end of an era of one of the most prosperous milling towns in Upper Canada. In 1792, the present site of Thornhill consisted of rolling hills, forests, and the Mississauga Indians. The forests and the Indians are gone, save for the reported site of their sacred burial grounds located near this tennis court on John Street. Thornhill was different from other locations in Upper Canada because it was situated on the banks of the Don River, which provided water for transportation and communication and power for water wheels in a milling industry. Moreover, Thornhill was on the direct route between Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe that also led to York, the capital of Upper Canada. For these reasons, General John Graves Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, made an exploratory trip through the area to see if it was suitable for a road and, in turn, a town. Simcoe then instructed Augustus Jones to survey the road. The road was to be called Yonge Street, in honor of Sir George Yonge, the Minister of War in the Imperial Cabinet and a friend of Governor Simcoe. William Mall Birchie, a colonization agent, was commissioned to build the road, and each of the settlers he brought with him was to be granted a plot of land along Yonge Street. Birchie was born in Austria to a noble family. One of his boyhood friends was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was a talented artist and architect who held utopian desires of bringing men and women from overcrowded Europe to begin a new life in America. His career was fraught with disappointments and financial losses, and when he died in New York City in 1812, it was as a ruined and embittered man. In 1792, Birchie led a group of German immigrants to the Pulteney settlement in the Genesee Valley in New York. But they didn't stay long because under New York law, they would never be able to own the land they farmed. They left for Upper Canada. Simcoe was glad to have them because most of the men were craftsmen, and their skills were useful in establishing a settlement. The settlers' departure from America caused much hard feelings, and the caravans of Conestoga wagons were often angrily pursued. The settlers arrived at their crown grants on the site of Thornhill in November of 1794. Birchie was to build Yonge Street and finish his work by September 15, 1795. Then he would personally receive 4 lots of land along the Don River, valuable for their water rights and suitable for a mill. Birchie's men were under the direction of Philip Eckhart, and the men cut a trail as far north as John Street in Thornhill from about Eglinton Avenue. But instead of continuing north, they turned east to establish Birchie's mill site at German Mills on the Don. Birchie said he'd been obliged to stop because of illness among his laborers. The Executive Council sent Simcoe's Queen's Rangers under the leadership of Augustus Jones to complete the road. Because he had not fulfilled his contract, the Executive Council revoked the land they had granted Birchie and gave him some less valuable land. Unable to obtain his rightful land patents, Birchie left Upper Canada for Montreal. Many of the settlers left when Birchie did. Some went back to the Genesee Valley, and others moved eastward to the Rouge River and founded the town of Unionville. Those that remained laid the solid foundations upon which the town of Thornhill was built.
In 1798, in order for a settler on Yonge Street to receive clear title to his land, he was required to build a home of at least 16 by 20 feet in size and live in it within 1 year of the granting the permission to settle. Settlers also had to clear and fence 5 acres of land within 1 year. That part of the road bounding the front of the lot had to be open and in good condition for its full width of 1/4 of a mile. The road was to be between 20 and 33 feet wide. This was not nearly as easy as it sounds, for clearing trees was a great task, and the trees were enormous. Often there would be no branches on the trees until 40 or 60 feet up from the ground, and the trees were 4 feet in diameter. Furthermore, it took from 6 to 10 years for stumps to decay, and this made it difficult to farm a field. Prisoners and convicted criminals were often sentenced to do community service in the form of stump removal and clearing of roadways as part of their punishment. The original Thornhill area was made up of 20 lots, 10 each on either side of Yonge Street, from Lot 26 at Steeles Avenue to Lot 35 to the north in the area of the Langstaff Road. The lots were approximately 200 acres each, with a frontage of about 1/4 of a mile, or 20 chains by 100 chains, a chain being 66 feet in length. The first concession, Vaughan, ran from Yonge Street west to Bathurst. Concession 1, Markham, from Yonge east to Bayview. The lots on the Vaughan side were actually about 210 acres, while those on the Markham side about 195 acres. The original patentees to receive grants were often United Empire Loyalists, or in some fashion, refugees, who left the United States if for no other reason than to avoid being tarred and feathered by the American rebels. British settlers followed them into the area somewhat later after the War of 1812. That is, the Napoleonic Wars ended in Europe. Some interesting anecdotes are recorded of these very first settlers into Thornhill. On the tombstone of Mrs. Elizabeth Cummer and Mrs. Eva Kober, both daughters of Jacob Fisher, it reads, "Of the first settlers on Yonge Street, there were the fifth family. Jacob Fisher received his grant to Lot 26, Vaughan, in 1798. Nathan Chapman received his patent to Lot 28, Vaughan, in 1796, at the age of 16. He built his log cabin, probably on the exact site of the house pictured here, built in 1865 by his grandson, Isaac Chapman. This land was continuously in the hands of the Chapman family from 1796 to 1937, when it was sold to Mr. George Spring by Nathan's granddaughters, Lucy and Bertha Chapman, who had grown too old to farm the land. Lucy Chapman recalled her father and grandfather Nathan relating stories of Indians camping on the flats overlooking the Don River and stealing bread baking in the settlers' outdoor ovens. Asa Johnson married Nathan Chapman's mother. Johnson was the first official settler on Yonge Street when he received his grant of Lot 29, Vaughan, south of present-day Arnold Street, in 1796. He owned a number of oxen which he used in the employ of Birchie in building Yonge Street. Over 100 oxen were used in working the road. As work progressed, 80 cows, heifers, and steers were driven to Asa Johnson's Lot 29 and to Nicholas Miller's Lot 34, Markham, from where they were distributed to individual settlers. Lot 30, Vaughan, was granted to John Wilson in 1810. Wilson had immigrated to America from England in 1752 at the age of 13. During the American War of Independence, he was a captain on the Loyalist side. As a result, his property was confiscated and he left New Jersey for St. John, New Brunswick on the Mayfleet about 1792. In 1793, a party of 46 United Empire Loyalists left New Brunswick for Upper Canada. Wilson and his 5 sons, Stillwell, John, Isaac, William, and Jonathan among them. 43 starving survivors arrived in Niagara in October 1794. His son Stillwell was appointed overseer of highways and fence viewer in 1799 and received a grant to Lot 30 Markham in 1808. Fences were supposed to be 5 feet high with no spaces over 4 inches. John Wilson and his nephew John Arnold were captains of the York militia taken prisoner by the Americans in the War of 1812, as cited in the terms of capitulation at the Fall of York, April 28, 1813. Captain John Wilson was 73 years old at the time of his capture. The oldest stone in Holy Trinity Cemetery reads, "In mind, Rebecca Wilson, wife of John Wilson, Esquire, departed June 6, 1804, aged 61 years. It is set in a cairn to commemorate her United Empire Loyalist husband, the first miller on the Humber and Justice of Peace, as well as her nephew, Captain John Arnold. It was moved to Holy Trinity Cemetery from Lot 26 Markham at Yonge and Steeles sometime after World War II, when when the Highland Park subdivision was opened up. Lot 31 Vaughan was granted to Daniel Soules in 1805. Soules served on juries and was appointed area constable. His son David built the Temperance Tavern in 1830 that still stands today. The southern part of this Lot 31 was surveyed into building lots along Yonge and Center Streets in the 1840s. Lot 34 Vaughan was granted to Nicholas Kober in 1798. In 1825, he built a sawmill there, which burnt down and was rebuilt in 1830 and sold to John Barwick in 1835. Barwick was married to one of Captain Simon Lee's 18 children. To the east of Yonge Street, on the Markham side, Nicholas Miller settled on Lot 34 Markham in 1794, where he reportedly built a small grist mill around the hollow stump of a large oak tree. Grain was placed in the hollow, and a long post was erected with a crotched top, which held a long crosspiece. From one end of the crosspiece, a heavy block of wood was hung directly over the stump. This block was pulled up with a rope and then let go, crashing down on the grain to reduce it to a coarse flour. This was probably the first flour mill in Thornhill. Lot 33 Markham was granted to John Lyons in 1796. Lyons was the first official pathmaster on Yonge Street, supervising its early construction. Anthony Hollingshead was granted Lot 32 Markham in 1802. The Thornhill Community Center, originally known as Sunnyside Manor, or more recently as the Heinzman House, is located on this lot. Part of this house was built by Colonel Cruikshank, a distiller, who acquired this lot sometime after 1812. Cruikshank was part of the second wave of British settlers, who tended to look down upon the first wave, that were mainly from the United States. Cruikshank was killed in the Crimean War, probably in 1855. Elizabeth Dennis received the grant to Lot 31 Markham in 1803. The magnificent Cricklewood, originally called Brooklands, still stands there today adjacent to the ladies' golf course. Elizabeth Dennis was married to Matthias Saunders, who was killed in the War of 1812. She subsequently married an American adventurer who took from her everything but the house. A ghost in this house can be traced back to the original owner, Miss Dennis, who once tried to cross the river in a storm. When the horses hesitated, she ordered the coachman to lead them across, and the coachman and horses drowned. They returned periodically with the sound of horses' hooves and a clanging bell to haunt the house. Lot 30 Markham, as mentioned earlier, was granted to John Wilson's son Stillwell, who was also fence viewer. The next lot south, number 29, was granted to Samuel Gardner in 1804. The original house, much altered and pictured here, was known as Rebel Haven because the rebel Mackenzie was said to have hidden there in 1837. Unfortunately, this historic home was demolished in 1987. Lots 28 and 27 were granted in 1805 and 1803, respectively, to Samuel Osborne and John Leslie, while Lot 26 was granted to W.I. Wilson, probably a brother to Stillwell. Some of these lots changed hands quickly, as the patentees were often unable to fulfill the conditions of their granting.
Prior to the 1830s, the center of Thornhill Village was located north of the Don Valley, clustered along Yonge Street near the mills located in the Don Valley. In 1830, Thornhill was a bustling town, supporting 4 sawmills, 2 distilleries, 3 blacksmith shops, 3 harness makers, a grist mill, tannery, and a carding and fulling mill. A cooper, millwright, stonemason, tailor, weaver, storekeeper, and wheelwright were also to be found in the village. The following are pictures from this 1830 village that have survived to the present time. This one is Soules Mansion House, also known as Soules Temperance Tavern and Mrs. Christian's Temperance Inn. It was built in 1830 by David Soules, as previously mentioned. This mill house was built in 1825 as a typical mill worker's home. It is probably the oldest intact and original house in the village. Captain Simon Lee of the East India Company built this home in 1832. much altered and destroyed by developers in July of 1979 for a small subdivision. 6 of Captain Lee's 18 children were born here. A toll gate, not unlike this one, was built just north of Captain Simon Lee's house at Langstaff Road on the west side of Yonge Street around 1830, through the efforts of Captain Edward O'Brien as a means of raising money to improve Yonge Street. Doctors, police, and firefighters were allowed free passage. For others, the toll was a halfpenny for sheep and pigs, 1 pence for cows, horses, and oxen, and 2 pence for pleasure vehicle and horse. From the money raised, a macadamized road was started in 1837 and completed in the area by 1857. Travelers, by law, had to have 2 or more bells affixed to their horse's harness or be fined 5 shillings. Hence came the saying, "I'll be there with bells on." Tolls were abolished in 1896. Holy Trinity Anglican Church, called Trinity until 1930, was built in 1830 on the west side of Yonge at present-day Royal Orchard Boulevard. It was moved piece by piece and rebuilt virtually unaltered at its present site on Brook Street in 1950. The Holy Trinity Cemetery, located behind the original site of the church, is Thornhill's oldest cemetery, dating back to the original settlement village of the late 1820s. The home on the left, slightly altered, was built in 1834 as a rectory for Reverend George Mortimer, one of the first ministers of Holy Trinity, or Trinity as it was called, until the 1950s. Reverend Mortimer had the upper windows shuttered as they let in too much light as well as cold, fresh air, which he considered unhealthy. This building was restored for commercial use in 1980. Reverend Mortimer was slightly deformed due to a childhood illness. In 1844, he was killed when his carriage upset on Yonge Street and he was thrown against a tree. This school, built in 1926, stands on ground that had been a schoolyard since 1815 and possibly as early as 1808. John Langstaff arrived from the United States about 1804 and taught in a house on or near this site until he quit to enter the War of 1812. This school was started on the site in 1811, but because of the War of 1812, was not completed until 1815. It was moved to the village of Edgeley at Jane and Highway 7 after being bought for $50. It burned in 1955. The Wesleyan Methodist Church was built in 1838 on Yonge Street near the present-day Baythorne Avenue and was moved to Center Street in 1856. Part of the gravesite still remains at the original location, as do the concrete posts that marked out the perimeter of the churchyard. In June of 1989, the Historical Society unveiled a plaque at this former Methodist burying ground. Officiating at this unveiling were, from left to right, Bob Sherwood, Councillor Thornhill Markham, Marie Baker, and Dina Charkozy, who cut the ribbon, Vic Stesick, President of the Society for the Preservation of Historic Thornhill, and the Reverend Mr. Brown, former minister of Thornhill United. This puritanical frame cottage at 8046 Yonge Street was built about 1830. This Ontario Classic frame house was reportedly built for Justice Hatfield around 1835. Mackenzie rebels are said to have used the spring that once flowed in the front yard to quench their thirst on the way to York in December of 1837. The house was brick veneered in the 1920s. The original Thornhill Settlement Village, located north of the valley, was known variously as Purdy's Mills, Atkinson's Mills, Lyons Mills, Thorne's Hill, York Hill, and Thorne's Mill. This center slowly moved south towards Center Street after Benjamin Thorne, pictured here, successfully petitioned the government for a post office circa 1828, and it was located south of the valley. Thorne arrived in Thornhill in 1820, 3 years after the arrival of his brother-in-law, William Parsons. It was on land given by Thorne in 1830 that the earlier pictured Holy Trinity Church was built. These memorial windows are dedicated to Parsons and Thorne. Thorne took ownership of Purdy's Mills, not unlike the ones pictured here, in 1828, and he added a tannery. The mill, located on the site of the present-day Thornhill Golf and Country Club, had millstones 6 feet high and the most modern in the district. Cement abutments of the mill can still be found on the golf course today. Thorne was a dynamic leader and can certainly be considered the founder of Thornhill. He was president of the Bank of Montreal in Upper Canada, and he laid the cornerstone of the first Bank of Montreal building at the corner of Yonge and Front Streets in Toronto. He also ran against and lost to William Lyon Mackenzie in 1830 for a seat on the Legislative Assembly. Under Thorne's business sense, the village prospered and a boom ensued.
At about this time, in the mid-1820s, Allen Napier McNabb became involved in Thornhill affairs. He erected a saw and grist mill where the Don crosses John Street. He also became involved in land speculation deals that involved himself, possibly his employer, the Attorney General, Darcy Bolton, and his brothers-in-law, George and Daniel Brooke. Brooke Street, surveyed in the 1830s, was named after this Brooke family, one of whom, Daniel, was reported to be with Colonel Moody at his home in Richmond Hill the night before Moody was shot at Montgomery's Tavern by the rebels. Also, a document exists, dated September 15, 1831, wherein Daniel Brooke petitioned Upper Canada College to include the less expensive and more practical English education in their curriculum, as well as a classical education. Brooke's sister Elizabeth died in 1825 after a short 7-year marriage to Allen Napier McNabb. This group of the Brookes, McNabbs, Boltons, and others purchased half of Lot 30 Markham, as well as the northeast quarter of Lot 30 Vaughan, with the hopes of founding a new village here to be called Dundurn, after McNabb's ancestral home on Loch Earn, Perthshire, Scotland. Building lots were surveyed along Yonge and Centre Streets, and streets were laid out. First buyers into this proposed new village included Robert Wiles, a wheelwright, Thomas Morgan, blacksmith, Benjamin Hayland, and James Gallino, who each paid £8.50 per quarter-acre lots, and Robert Shooter, storekeeper, who paid £40 for a 1-acre lot at the corner of Yonge and Centre Streets. These are the only 2 surviving buildings of the fated Dundurn village, both built by the Shooters, with the latter moved from Yonge and Centre to Elizabeth Street in 1929 to make way for Thornhill's first gas station. It was built by John Francis Jr. in 1905 around the original timbers of the Shooters store. The surviving streets of the original Dundurn village were Elizabeth and Jane Street, originally named Strawn and Hillier, and Maitland Street, probably set at the present Brook Street. Maitland was the lieutenant governor of the time. Hillier was his aide-de-camp, and Strawn was first Anglican bishop of the area. Jane, or Hillier as it was first called, was surveyed to continue west of Brook, or Maitland, such that the large lot and house, a group of 7 artist J.E.H. MacDonald, was meant to face south, with a pretty stream running in the backyard and not across the front, as it does now.
It was about this time that William Lyon Mackenzie was leading a rising tide of reform against the attempt to establish a privileged class and a privileged church. Among the major grievances listed by these reformers was the monopolization of privilege by the family compact, the land set aside for the church known as the clergy reserves, unemployment, poor roads, enormous unwarranted expenditures on the Welland Canal, and a general lack of schools. Rebellion was in the air. The family compact dominated the legislative and executive councils and were responsible to no one, least of all the House of Assembly. Thornhill played a leading role in the rebellion of 1837. The epithet, son of a rebel, was enough to start a fistfight in any one of the 4 taverns in the area. The Frizzell family, who lived in this house on John Street, were staunch Tory loyalists. Sutton Frizzell came to York in 1800 with the 100th Regiment. He was as well a beef provisioner for the regiment, although a fall from his horse resulted in partial loss of his reason. His son Richard was a bit of a hellion with little regard for the rebels of '37. It is recorded that at noon of the 18th of October, 1837, he stole a rebel Liberty or Death flag planted in front of Gibson's house, tore it to shreds, and wove the pieces as decoration into the tails of the rebels' horses. Richard acted as one of the Paul Reveres of the rebellion. He was a strong young man with strong opinions and a fondness for liquor, encouraged by his job in nearby Morgan's distillery. On the night of December 4th, 1837, Dick was at home, feeling depressed mentally and physically from the excesses of a recent outing. At about 9 o'clock, he noticed rebel movement on Yonge Street near his home. Dressed in whatever he could find, for his mother, fearing the worst, had hidden his clothes, Dick left northward for Thorne's and Parsons' store. His brother Nelson followed. At the store, he may have convinced Thorne to lend him a horse, although Thorne was reluctant as half his employees were rebels. However, in private, he told Frizzell to go for God's sake, but be cautious. He was followed by Richard Murphy, a Thorne employee and presumably a rebel supporter, who tried by all means to stop Frizzell. Frizzell went directly to City Hall to speak with the governor, Sir Francis Bond Head. Upon being informed of the movement of the rebels, Bondhead was supposed to have replied, "We can do nothing. Why, what can we do? There is not a soldier in Upper Canada. I wrote Sir John Colborne to take every man there was here, if they were required, and they were taken to Lower Canada." The rebels were subsequently dispersed, in part through the efforts of none other than Allan McNabb, who arrived by steamer from Hamilton, bringing 60 men with him. In the area of Hogg's Hollow and Montgomery Tavern, near the fields that are now the area of Yonge and Eglinton, the rebels were routed and sent a-fleeing on Thursday, December 8th, 1837. McNabb was subsequently knighted for his efforts and went on to become the Prime Minister of the United Canadas in 1854. However, on Monday, December 5th, the Tory loyalist, Colonel Moody from Richmond Hill, who also tried to warn the governor at York, was shot and killed at Montgomery's Tavern. Moody had gone safely through the Peninsular Wars in Spain and the battle at Queenston Heights, only to die ignominiously at a backwoods tavern. Moody was buried later that week in Holy Trinity Cemetery in Thornhill. Reverend Mortimer and the congregation fully expected a rebel attack, and many came armed with guns, pistols, and even pitchforks. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Samuel Lount and others suspected in the murder. Richard Frizzell, who knew Lount well and considered him a friend, refused to betray Lount's whereabouts. Lount was subsequently captured, tried, and hanged.
So ended a turbulent and exciting period in the history of Upper Canada, except for the presence in Thornhill of one mysterious Morgan, who is referred to in E.C. Kite's book, Old Toronto, as Dick Frizzell's employer and as the brewer and distiller well known throughout America in connection with the anti-Masonic excitement. Also, the rebels and Mackenzie, their leader, were supposed to have hidden out in a root cellar of a man named Morgan, probably on Elgin Street, just north of the hill commonly known as Morgan's Hill. The Morgan family had arrived in Thornhill from Scotland in 1820. For his part, Mackenzie was known to have many American connections and eventually fled there. But back to the mysterious Morgan. In the American presidential election of 1832, Andrew Jackson was somewhat unexpectedly elected president, probably due to the presence in the election of the anti-Masonic candidate, William Wirt. How did this anti-Masonic party get started? In 1826, a William Morgan in New York State and a Mason vowed to publish an expose of Masonry. He was arrested and imprisoned for a $2.69 debt, although the real reason seemed to be his determination to publish the secrets of the first 3 degrees in a book entitled Illustrations of Masonry. This he did. Someone paid Morgan's debt. He was released from jail, but as he stepped out into the street, he was seized, gagged, and thrust into a yellow carriage. There was a wild ride, with relays of horses, to the Niagara frontier. There, all trace of Morgan was lost, forever. It was commonly believed he was murdered and dropped into Lake Ontario. His disappearance excited great interest. Investigations were apparently being obstructed by politically influential Masons. Popular indignation reached a boiling point. Anti-Masonry, a third political party, was born. Just prior to the American presidential election of 1832, a corpse found near the mouth of the Niagara River was said to be Morgan's and was claimed by his family. It turned out to be someone else, but a prominent anti-Mason party leader, Thurlow Weed, cynically stated, "It was a good enough Morgan till after the election," a remark that became proverbial for campaign deceit. Although the anti-Masonic presidential candidate William Wirt only got 35,000 votes or so, this was enough to draw support from Republican Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson, a Democrat and a Mason, was reelected. And who or where was mysterious Morgan all this while? According to John Ross Robertson in Landmarks of Toronto, and reprinted in E.C. Kite's Old Toronto, he was operating one of Thornhill's first distilleries, with Dick Frizzell as one of his employees, and possibly also supplying refuge in his cellar to William Lyon Mackenzie.
The next 2 decades following the rebellion and preceding Confederation were generally progressive and prosperous. Responsible government had been won under the governorship of Lord Elgin, pictured here, in whose honor a street in Thornhill was named. In the 2 decades from 1840 to 1860, Thornhill's population doubled from 300 to 600. Mills, such as the one pictured here, were operating at full capacity of 45,000 barrels of flour per year. Thorne sent flour to England and had iron ore sent back, such that in the 1840s, iron ore imports by Thorne were bigger than that of any other merchant in Canada. Thornhill was the main milling and brewing center of Upper Canada. Distilleries and breweries were built near grist mills to use the damaged grain and tailings from these flour mills. At a time when most businesses in Upper Canada operated on a barter system, Thorne could afford to pay cash to the farmers for their produce. In fact, Thorne's business was so big that as big as his mills were, with the largest 6-foot millstones in Upper Canada, he often could not keep up with demand, and it was not uncommon to see wagons lined up until 10 o'clock at night on Yonge Street waiting their turn to use the mill. But the bubble of prosperity was bound to burst. The Corn Laws in England were repealed in 1846. As reported in the St. Catherine's Journal on May 14, 1846, except a war with the United States, no other event could have created greater apprehension in the minds of the agricultural population of Upper Canada. Thorne put his affairs in order, sold his mills, and on May 28, 1848, advertised in the Globe and Mail a public auction of all his possessions to be held at Lemon's Inn at Yonge and John at 10 a.m. on Friday, June 2nd. The auction completed, Thorne walked onto a rocky knoll in the woods behind his house, just behind the present-day Thornhill Country Club, an area that came to be known as Thorne's Rock, and shot himself. He left behind a wife and 8 children. So ended an era in Thornhill and Upper Canada when villages and towns could no longer depend only on a milling industry to support the economy, when railway building began to rival the rivers as means of transportation, and when the coming of Confederation offered the prospect of new opportunities for the people of villages and towns of Upper Canada.